The Vale Levitt Music Hall was built by David F. Vale and his son George Vale in 1881. It opened October 11, 1881, and has had a very interesting history. The miniature opera house was designed by Mr. J. W. Flack and began its operation with candle lighting. Eventually, gas fixtures were placed along the balcony. Electric lights were installed when electricity became available in the area. Thomas Edison used the music hall to demonstrate the synchronization of sound and film. The music hall was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on August 25, 1983. Its grand reopening was held on June 28, 2003, and the hall continues to host numerous cultural, civic, and charitable events for the local community.
Let us pause in life's pleasures and count the many tears while we all sup sorrow with the poor. 'Tis a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the sound and the song of the weary. Hard times come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. You guns and drums and drums and drums and roo. You guns and drums and drums and drums and roo. With your guns and drums and drums and drums, the army nearly slew ya. Oh, my darling dear, you look so queer. Oh, Johnny, I hardly knew ya. Oh, where were your eyes that were so mild, Roo? Where were your eyes that were so mild, Roo? Where were your eyes that were so mild, that looked upon the world and smiled? Oh, why did you run run from being a child. Ah, Johnny, I hardly.
Welcome to the beginning of the 4th anniversary of the war. Last year, when we held our memorial in Greenport for the 1,500 soldiers who had been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and for the tens of thousands of Iraqis who have been slaughtered, it never occurred to us, to some of us, that we would be repeating this event a year later. We were ready to move on to other important issues, but all roads lead us back to this war. When our tax dollars are being spent on the destruction of another country, and our own country has been morally and financially bankrupted by an administration who has forgotten that they are supposed to represent the American people, how can we move on? Our purpose for gathering here today is not just to memorialize the soldiers who have lost their lives and the Iraqis who have lost theirs. Our other purpose here today is to help create the next generation of activists. With knowledge comes responsibility. How can we as Americans sit silently by when we know that our country is torturing innocent people, when our leaders have ignored our constitutional checks and balances? How much are we willing to tolerate before we speak out and say no more of this senseless killing? What will we tell our children and grandchildren when they ask us why we did nothing to stop the violence? All of you who came here today did so because you have had enough of the war, which perpetuates hatred and breeds more killing, and therefore we must tell this administration, not on my watch and not without a fight. Now is the time to absorb the lessons we have learned from the past and pull together as a community. We must all be activists because activism is the antidote to despair. Any level of activism is powerful. Just coming here is very important. Picking up the phone and calling your legislators is one of the most important things you can do. In whatever way you can, show the world that George W. Bush does not represent the American people. You will be vastly rewarded for your efforts. As Alice Walker says, activism is my rent for living on this planet. For those who are not yet activists, your rent is due. We want to thank all the volunteers who have worked so hard today, and thank you all for coming, and hope that you continue our fight. Thank you.
We are very honored to have 4 speakers today. 2 of them are veterans, one of the Vietnam War and one of the Iraq War. We have a retired New York City police officer, and we have a peace activist. They will each be speaking to you, and we'll introduce them as they come up. The first speaker is Michael Harmon. He is a member of the Iraq Vets Against the War, and he promised, or threatened, threatened to speak for only about 4 minutes. So I think I'm going to have to say a little bit about him, which is just culled from an email that he sent introducing himself. He joined the Army in 2002, partly because of 9/11. He was deployed to Iraq on April 2nd, 2003, as part of the initial invasion forces. His unit was, I don't even know how to say this Army stuff, 167 Armor Battalion with the 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Hood, Texas. He was a combat medic, and he was 10 miles north of Baghdad. He spent 13 months in a blown-out hospital that he said we called home. He received an Army Commendation Medal with Valor for saving 3 soldiers' lives along with 2 other medics, and returned home on April 29, 2004. He's now engaged he's back to school, learning some fairly arcane sort of medical thing, as I understand it. He'll tell you about that. So Michael, please come and tell people.
It was respiratory therapy. First off, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to stand for this war, for what it really is, and to Pat and Hazel for this wonderful memorial to my fallen brothers. My name is Michael Harmon. I enlisted in the Army in May 2002, partly because of 9/11 and partly because of no real direction in life. I was lied to by the recruiters right off the bat when I was told I was going to be a healthcare specialist, which later turned out to be a combat medic. Shortly after I joined, there were rumors about war in Iraq, and sure enough, on Martin Luther King Day 2003, we had a special formation for the colonel to tell us that we were officially going to war. I didn't feel like this was warranted, since the Iraqis had nothing to do with 9/11. When we got to Kuwait in April 2003 as part of the initial invasion force, it was definitely an eye-opening experience. 2 weeks into the war, we were told to put our protective mask and chemical gear away. I'm not a military intelligence officer or a CIA agent, but I thought we were supposed to be there to rid the country of weapons of mass destruction. So being a native New Yorker with a smart mouth, I asked the major who told us to put our gear in the bottom of our duffel bag, "Sir, with all due respect, we were here for weapons of mass destruction." He replied, "Do what you're told, son, and shut your mouth." From that point on, I knew this war was just a fabrication by Bush's regime and that it was unjust. Living conditions were real hard, and in the first couple months we were living off of 2 bottles of water and 1 MRE a day. We did not receive mail until July, which extremely crushed our morale. The event that really turned me was when one of my good friends died because an insurgent decided to pose as a hospital worker and drop a grenade on him and 2 other soldiers. At that point, I wanted this war to end immediately, but I had to cope because I was doc and the first line of medical treatment for 350 soldiers. That was really hard on me mentally, and you could tell the other soldiers were feeling the same way, especially when we were being strung along about how long the deployment was actually going to be. Now what the media, especially Fox News, doesn't show you is the dead and injured kids, and that will be burned in my memory forever. When soldiers in their mid-20s and early 30s are crying for their mothers and wives because they don't want to die, that takes a tremendous toll on you. When I came home, I had a lot of trouble adjusting back to civilian life, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. So I went to the troop clinic, and I was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which also affected about 60% of the deployed soldiers. The clinic decided just to throw pills at me, like Paxil, which at times made me feel even worse and suicidal. I started to cope my own way with alcohol, and I hit the bottle really hard. It got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I told the Army I wanted out. When I came home to New York, I fell deeper in a dark hole, and when I tried to go to the local VA, they told me they were backed up in claims and what I was feeling was normal. That is when I joined the Iraq Veterans Against War, because I felt I needed to surround myself with fellow vets who had similar problems and who also felt that Bush lied just to start this immoral war. I felt that I was supposed to be fighting for freedom, but when I came home, all the American people's freedoms were taken away due to the Patriot Act and illegal NSA spying. There was one time I came home from Iraq from mid-tour leave, and airport security made me step aside so they could wave the wand around me, and I was in full uniform. I couldn't believe it. Here I am fighting and risking my life in Iraq so we could keep freedom due to supposed terrorist threats, and I felt like the enemy. Everything the Bush regime tries to justify about infringing on civil liberties is unconstitutional any way you look at it. He has to be stopped, and the time is now that we all stand together to put him out of office. He has shredded the Constitution, and as you can see here, killed over 2,300 good American soldiers. If we all stick together for this cause, we will prevail. Thank you, and bring the troops home now.
Thank you, Michael. I'm sure some of you would like to ask him questions. We just have a really tight schedule, but he will be around during the break, which we'll be having, and also after the program is over. So I'm sure you will find him accessible, and I'm sure he'd like to answer your questions. I'm now going to introduce the film, Occupation Dreamland, that we have scheduled. When we first contacted the producers of this film, the director, I believe he was a co-director, was Gareth Scott. Since then, at the age of 37, Gareth died on March the 2nd. A completely freak accident. He was in California to participate in the Independent Spirit Awards for his film. And he was swimming in a public pool, visiting his parents, and he died of a cardiac arrest at the age of 37. So what I'd like to do in just introducing this film to you is to take excerpts in his words, since he's not here to give them to us himself, words that came out of an interview where he was asked about, this was actually his second documentary. I'll start with, first of all, the New York Times, when in their review of the film, and the film did win an award, by the way, for it won the Truer Than Fiction Award in Santa Monica 2 days after he died. The film has an intimate, personal quality, reflecting the filmmaker's hard-won bond with the soldiers, hard-won bond with soldiers. This is, it's not like other war films, and we do see some violence, but what it really is, it's a very up-close and personal picture of these soldiers, and in a way it's a very small movie, because it's really just about these soldiers and their particular situation. As he said, nobody really gets an idea of what the phenomenon of war is, what it's like. He said it's going on all the time, and there are 160,000 people over there. They're from the US, but what is their experience really like? What do they do? What does this war actually look like to them? What does all this boredom mean? He also said that the film, and you see it in the film, how little of this each side knows about the other, how little these US soldiers know about the Iraqis and vice versa, even though they've crossed over into the most intimate space of each other's lives. And he said they were not judgmental when they made the film. They didn't try to look at anything other than what these soldiers were telling them. We just took what they were doing for granted. And so, like the Iraqis, they were very hospitable. They allowed us into this intimate space of theirs, and we didn't abuse that. We were simply interested in what they thought and what they did. He said this is really a movie about enlisted men and what it's like to be someone with very little information who simply follows orders. So I think he was very pleased with public reaction to his film, and I'm, again, very, very sorry that he met this untimely death, as I'm sure you all are. So, occupation, please.
The whole weekend of it, it's the third annual Musicians for Peace project that started 3 years ago at SUNY University in Stony Brook, and I put together my own concert to send out some good energy into the world. And that's going to be April 2nd, which is 2 Sundays from today, and it's going to be at Stony Brook at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship there. And it's going to be some great music. I'll be there with with one of my bands, and Sonny Meadows. Anyone ever hear of Sonny Meadows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pause. He's a really effective, funny, touching political songwriter. To me, in the tradition of Leon Redbone. Not that he was a political songwriter, but that kind of feel to his performance. Much of the word love and the word God is defined by the media and organizations, and we all have to find our own definitions for it. So as I've gotten older, I've created my own definition for it. So through that, I'm more comfortable using the term. Right, Brian? Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from And my favorite version is by the Weavers. As I said earlier, I was raised by the Weavers. I'm always proud of the fact that my father actually saw Lead Belly and Woody Guthrie live down in the Village.
Shalom Chaverim, Shalom Chaverim, Shalom, Shalom, Lahitraut, Lahitraut, Shalom, Shalom.
If you know it, help me along.
Shalom Chaverim, Shalom Chaverim, Shalom, Shalom, Lahitraut, Lahitraut, Shalom, Shalom. Glad tidings we bring, that peace on earth, goodwill towards men. Let peace on earth, let peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Want to try one more time?
Shalom Chaverim, Shalom Chaverim, Shalom, Shalom, Lahitraut, Lahitraut, Shalom, Shalom. Good tidings we bring, that peace on earth, goodwill towards men. That peace on earth, that peace on earth, goodwill towards men, goodwill towards men.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this whole dissent is unpatriotic, and it really stopped me in my tracks and started to make me think, geez, am I doing these people a disservice by being out there? You know, they need our support. Well, yeah, they need our support, and I know I'm preaching to the converted. They need our support to bring them home. And I started to wonder why people think dissent is unpatriotic. And there's two things that I came up with, and maybe you can share some things that you know you've thought about that. One, I think that they're fearful for our men and women in uniform, that they're going to come home and they're going to be mistreated like they were in the past. And I think we are a kinder, gentler nation, and we kind of know what's going on, and we know we need to be protected, and we're really grateful for the work and the commitment that they give to the armed forces and where they serve. But they can come home into the bosom of kindness. We will be kind, and we'll be glad they're home and safe and sound. I also want the people who think dissent is unpatriotic to be not afraid. To be not afraid that if we're protesting the war, that pride will be hurt. That our precious children and husbands and wives and people across the seas, that they will feel duped like all of us do and hurt their pride. And I just want to say, you know what? Our pride gets hurt and we rebound and then we fight for what's right. So again, bring them on home. That's our support. So I'd like to do one more song, and this kind of goes out to all the younger generation who might not know this song. And it's really important. I remember marching down in Washington several times before the war, during the war, and no one was singing, really. You know, they weren't singing the old anti-war songs, and they weren't singing any new anti-war songs. And so I started to write some anti-war songs, but I also want to share some of the older stuff that the younger people who are now joining the fight for freedom and justice may not know. So I know you're going to join me on this. And I'm going to stop singing if you don't. Let's see.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We'll stand and fight together. We shall not be moved.
Let me hear you.
stand and fight together. We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We'll call for peace together. We shall not be moved. We'll call for peace together. We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Come on, let's sing it. We'll sing together. We shall not be moved. We're singing together. We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We'll clap them together. We shall not be moved. Sing a song. We're clapping together. We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. A little louder. We shall not be moved. No, no. We shall not be moved, just like the tree. Yeah, standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be, no, no, no. Will we be moved? We shall not be, we shall not be moved.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Such an honor to play here. And hope to see you at the concert. Grab a flyer and join us. That's April 6th.
I'd like to introduce the next speaker. I know. Well, we are people of conscience. We don't have names. But the man who just said that is Carmen Trotter. And we heard him speak in Washington Square Park, and that's the only reason that we invited him here today, because he was such a terrific speaker. And I'm going to let him tell you more about himself, but what I can tell you is that he's a leading member of the Catholic Worker Movement. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. And we are very honored that he's agreed to participate in our day today. So Carmen, will you just tell them more about yourself, including that thing about Shannon and the...
I agree with you. We may get that.
Thank you all. Before, when the movie was on, I can't see the top, but what I wanted to say is that the Voices Against the War had a full house here. They had a full house here. And I wonder, and I beg you to wonder, how many other places have a full house today against this war around the country? Around the world. How many contact names, how much contact info for the other people on Long Island that are demonstrating against this war do we have? There's a great deal of work to be done. There is an enormous amount of work to be done. And I'm so happy, I'm overjoyed to be here. Because for the first time in my life, I am fearful. I am deeply fearful because in the last couple of years, I have come to believe that we can no longer reform this country. Republican Party, Democratic Party, they both want this war. They both need the oil. There is no way as yet to reform this country, and yet there is a world begging. The strongest political voice in the world is the voice of the American people, if they would begin to speak, and if they would begin to speak articulately. So we have a great deal of work to be done. As I said, when you get scared, and I'm scared, the first resource that you need to gather about some people, and you need to gather about a community. Dr. Martin Luther King said it was chaos or community. We need to begin to form communities. We need to begin to form peace communities. And overjoyed to be a part of that happening here today. I understand that in this next week, Hillary Clinton, who is bound to be the Democratic candidate for president, is going to be speaking at Stony Brook University. How many of you are going to be there? People should be there. People should start thinking of making commitments to be there as a community. I think there's some folks here who have information on that. It is not for me to do, but I hope later they are allowed on the stage so they could hand that out. And I hope people seriously consider being there, because people want to do an action against the war, and she needs to hear it, that she cannot be the President of the United States unless she's going to come out against this war. And I'll tell you what, Hillary Clinton is too deeply embedded. She is not going to come out against this war. I very much wanted to thank, in the interest of community, Claudia Jacobs and the music that we've had today. In part because I thought of beginning today by asking for a show of hands, and I'm not going to do it. A show of hands of how many of you love your country. I don't want to see it, because all I want to say to you is that for a long time, I would have reservations about raising my hand for that, for many years. In fact, I used to always think of what was the Jewish play, Fiddler on the Roof, which was about sort of arranged marriages. One generation had arranged marriages, the new generation didn't want to have arranged marriages. The old man in the house who believes in tradition is annoyed at his son because he wants to marry for love. But at some point, the idea of marrying for love begins to trouble him, and he turns around to his wife of many years. They've had children together, they've lived together for years, and he says to her, not knowing somehow, "Do you love me?" And she gets angry. She gets angry, and she says, "I'm your wife." So every time someone asks me whether or not I love my country, I want to say, "I'm your wife." And when I think of whether or not I love the United States, I love Elvis Presley. I'm the biggest Elvis Presley fan you've ever met. Do I love the United States? Let me tell you more. When I really think, when it comes down to it, what I love Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. Martin Luther King could not come from any other place but this country and its history. And that's where I want my life to be. And so I was so impressed by Claudia because there was a lot of black in her voice. And that last song she sang wasn't a peace song. It was a civil rights song. And what we need is a peace movement of greater breadth, depth, and duration than the American Civil Rights Movement. And that was a great commitment on the part of a lot of people. Rosa Parks passed away this year. Everyone in this country knows that Rosa Parks was a black woman who got just too angry and refused to move off of a front row seat in the bus to go to the back of the bus because of the indignity that it represented to her people. Unfortunately, that's about all we know. And that little bit of information, or unless we study it, and the documents are out there, there's plenty of stuff to read. But when I am presented with that story, I am always presented with it as though Rosa Parks was some woman out of nowhere who just got angry. But the fact is, and get this fact, Rosa Parks was not merely a card-carrying member of the NAACP. Rosa Parks was a staff member. And for months prior to her sitting down in the seat, they were looking for a candidate to sit down in the front seat of a bus and refuse to move. And she really, quite on her own, and she did surprise the organization by doing it, and she really was fed up. But they had gone through several other candidates, but no one was the premier personality that could speak to the media, that could speak to the courts. And someone had to do it, and ultimately she did. What I am saying is that Rosa Parks was part of a community. And she was part of an activist community and a part of a community that organized, and that organized intelligently, that thought of ways to communicate with passion and honesty to people. And in that case, such a small symbolic act that kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott and brought us ultimately, well, many figures and a great change in our nation's history that must be pursued and followed, because it's certainly not an end. But she brought us Dr. Martin Luther King. And I wanted to begin today because I think the anti-war analysis of Dr. King from the war in Vietnam, a lot of relationships are drawn between the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq and how to stop them. And part of the reason for my despair is that I'll go into later, because I do want to look at Vietnam versus Iraq. But I actually want to go back and look at what Dr. King did. April 3rd, 1967, a year to the day that he was assassinated, a year to the day. Of course, King came out against the war, against the advice of almost all of his advisors. He was perceived as a civil rights leader, as the leader of the black community. This was beyond his realm. Many of his closest advisors were against his coming out against the war. And yet, he said he could not segregate his conscience, and that he was going to come out and speak against the war. And indeed he did, in the graceful and beautiful way that he spoke every time he opened his mouth. He said at Riverside Church in New York City that Vietnam was indeed a disgraceful war. His analysis was basically that you had a nationalist movement in Vietnam that we were intervening in, and that we didn't really have the best intentions, the best wishes for the Vietnamese people. We had something else at that stake. He also informed the American people, a notoriously or ill-informed people, about some history regarding Vietnam, including the fact that as early as 1954, the U.S. was funding 80% of the French effort to regain its colonial system in Indochina. That was part of his speech, trying to inform people in that way. That is very good history, and not many people know it, because after World War II, the Allies sort of agreed that France and other states could retake their old colonial holdings back for a new sort of global arrangement. The French, of course, lost in 1954. While they were losing at Dien Bien Phu, where they lost their final battle, the United States actually offered them at that point 3 nuclear weapons. The French were appalled, not because they were afraid of using nuclear weapons, but if they were to drop a nuclear weapon in any kind of tactically sensible way, they would incinerate all of their own troops. So the French didn't take that option. But Vietnam was primarily, again, about resurrecting French Indochina and a colonial system whereby the West was taking the human and material resources of Vietnam for its own benefit. That is, for the benefit of the American public, and mostly for the benefit of Western-based international capitalist corporations. Yes? Yeah. I have one here. Thank you. The next day after King came out with his statement, and we'll go into a little more of it later, Life magazine said it sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. The Washington Post said that we could no longer accord the respect that we had previously given Martin Luther King, and that he should keep to his civil rights work. Martin Luther King said that we were over in Vietnam fighting for rights purportedly in Southeast Asia that blacks didn't have in Southeast Georgia. But more, and the most important thing that I think he said, is that it wasn't only Vietnam. He said it would be seductively tempting to speak only of Vietnam and to think that that was the malady, that was the trouble. But he said there's a far deeper malady that affects the American spirit. And that malady was the domination of our society by very large corporations. Had put together a pattern, he said a pattern of suppression. He named Venezuela, Colombia, several other Latin American countries that were more concerned about profits than they were about people. They were more concerned about property rights than they were about human rights. And he said at the end of his speech that we needed a radical revolution of values, declaring eternal hostility, as he said, to poverty, racism, and militarism. Martin Luther King was correct. Let us also remember that Martin Luther King died fighting. That Martin Luther King wasn't a hero when he died. Martin Luther King used to go and talk, and only a couple of hundred people used to come at the end of his career. Martin Luther King died fighting. Martin Luther King was on a campaign when he was shot. The battle was not over. The battle was would certain ways taper off, certainly, after that war in Vietnam. I believe I have 10 minutes, and we'll try and get through the various. I have way too many notes, but I'm trying to pare this down properly. The reason that we are in Iraq. Okay, Vietnam and Iraq. The quick comparison is that we lost 59,000 Americans or thereabouts in Vietnam on a venture that was as colonial and criminal as the present venture in Iraq. In Vietnam, however, Vietnam was a beautiful gem in terms of what it could offer the markets, in terms of what human and material resources, mainly material resources, we could take out of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia included. Iraq is the name of the game. Iraq is not a geostrategic gem. Iraq is sort of just about everything. By the year 2030, the world as a whole is going to need to produce 45% more oil than it is presently producing. Markets like China are growing at a phenomenally fast rate. India also. Those economies need oil if we are going to persist on an oil-based economy. The United States does not merely want access to oil, and it does not merely want access to oil at a decent price. Like the British Empire of old, the United States wants to be able to control world oil supply. We want to be able to, ultimately, if need be, make sure that we have all the oil we need, and in a pinch, or a crisis, or as a negotiating chip, we need to be able to define the terms by which others get oil, including cutting off their oil. So this is what the war is about. And I believe that this administration, and I believe the Democrats also, look out at perhaps a 20-year window of opportunity where the United States is simply so powerful, that we could slap the world around. We've been slapping the world in the face for actually more than the past 4 years, or 8 years, or 15 years. But at this point, it is so overt. It is almost like asking you, do you get the message? Do you get the message? Tony Blair, at one point when I was doing some activism work over in Ireland, told the British public, the American president has spoken. I'm telling you, the American president has spoken. He repeated that phrase. He's taking orders from Washington, D.C. Now, people should know there is a great deal to do. It's not simply about marching in the street. Did you hear the veterans on TV? Did you hear those young people? So many of them not knowing what the next step in life was, really not knowing what to do with themselves, having sort of nothing to do. And so they went into the military because there were a couple of benefits offered and it might help them get some structure or something. There are other ways to provide structure to the lives of young people than to send them to the military. But how many of them, the goodwill in a certain way, the goodwill, yes, they were sent to possibly die and to kill. And society said, it's okay, it's an honorable profession, go. In any cause that they send you to, including an immoral, illegal, and ill-advised war like the present one. Go. How many of them, every one of them, when you see them talk, every one of them would have went to Iraq to help out a third world nation or a second world nation. Iraq at one point was quite a first world nation, to help rebuild things. There is so much goodwill in so many people that we need to access that. We need to access that globally, and we need to create communities and a wider society that accesses that from people so we can live fuller lives. Fuller lives. The ignorance that they had, that they began to admit to, certain of them were admitting to. When the one kid was talking about, they say centuries ago, the greatest mathematicians in the world came from Iraq. Yeah, that's right. We know so, the stunning, breathtaking ignorance of ourselves, myself included, has got to be a part of the process of our community building. And so, just a couple of those small facts to inform people about this war in Iraq. Well prior to the invasion in April 2002, we already had something called the Future of Iraq Project. Just by the way, right now we also have a project for the future of Cuba for its democratic transition, which is when Fidel dies, we may be invading Cuba. I'm sure. Okay. And the Future of Iraq was planning just how to control, once we occupied and took over Iraq, Iraq's oil supply. They have been feverishly working on that. It doesn't make the newspaper every day. We were working on that with the dozens of Iraqi expatriates, exiles, one whose name you know, Chalabi, who's now in the energy sector in Iraq. He holds a position there. And Ibrahim Bahar al-Ulum, forgive me my mispronunciation, which is very likely, but he's presently the Minister of Oil. So he was planning with Blair and Bush and the State Department for the ultimate invasion of Iraq. He is now the Minister of Oil in Iraq. Present policy, if their plans work, and their plans are very sophisticated with lawyers, there is a sort of technical agreement whereby the Iraqi state will continue to actually own the oil as long as it's in the soil, but the companies will have all the rights to it. And in terms of profit sharing, that will come a little later down the line to be negotiated. But as it turns out, Iraq presently has, I'm looking for my notes, 80 oil wells. Only 17 of them are functional, but 80 are tapped, or sort of ready to go. What the Iraqi state is saying to the Iraqi people is all the oil that we are presently producing will still be controlled by the Iraqi state. That is true, 17 wells. The other 80 are to be given over to multinational corporations, the super majors, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, BP. Those are the wells that are existing. It is quite possible that Iraq has twice as much oil as we already know it has. It is even possible that they have 3 times as much. So we are going to be controlling, at present, we will control the West. Western capital will control 64% of Iraqi oil. If in fact Iraqi has what most of the world believes it has, which is double the amount of oil, we will control 84% of Iraqi oil. If, as the Iraqi oil ministry says, they have 3 times the oil that we presently know, the present reserves, we will be controlling 87% of Iraqi oil. So what the war is about is oil. As Noam Chomsky recently said, we didn't go to fight in Iraq because they grew lettuce there. Yeah. Time. Let me try and end then. It took a lot to get the United States to leave Vietnam. And remember, it wasn't electing the Democrats that got us out of Vietnam. It was the utter criminality and corruption of the Nixon government. Yes, I say that there are 3 factors that led the U.S. to leave Vietnam. The first, and not unimportant in any way, was that there was a peace movement here. There was a peace movement that aligned itself, that coordinated with a civil rights movement that grew up out of it, and that was demanding that we be what we said we always are, which is a self-governing people. That we should be a self-governing people, a democracy. So they used to talk about, what was the phrase that they used? Participatory democracy, a deliberately redundant phrase they used to use. So the first thing was the peace movement. The second thing was the phenomenal coherence and heart of the Vietnamese people. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. The Vietnamese were going to continue to resist. We see some of that in Iraq today, but a much more disintegrated people, many different groups, unlike Vietnam. The most important thing, unfortunately, and this is the reason in part for my despair, it took a great deal to get the U.S. to leave Vietnam. It took a great deal. And one of the reasons was that key elements, and I take this from Chomsky, key elements of the Democratic Party recognized that this long war was draining the U.S. economy relative to other economies in the world. Primarily, the concern was Japan and Korea. The Vietnam War was an enormous boost to the Japanese and South Korean economies. The United States began to feel, key policymakers began to feel that we were losing leverage globally, and therefore they were open. So ultimately it was self-interested. And we continue to live in a world where when we talk about peace, we very rarely mean a genuine peace. What we mean is stalemated violence. Stalemated violence. And that we call peace. On February 15th, around the world, before the start of this war, hundreds of thousands of people in major cities and capitals around the world came out to stop a war. It's never happened in the history of this globe. It's never happened in human history that many people wanted to say no to a war. So there is a resource, there is a hope. The only hope that I know is the hope that Martin Luther King asked us to come to. He said that there were only two choices. There was chaos or community. We need to form a community. Now, thank you.
John Phillips, can you come up now, John? John was retired from the New York Police Department about 10 years ago.
To the mic,
About 10 years ago, or maybe it was 1983, I'm not sure, I got my facts wrong here. But he became an activist, and activism is what we want to talk about today. He became an activist while the threats of the invasion were in the air. Not 3 years ago today, but when the gathering storms were gathering, to coin a phrase. So John, would you come and talk to us? The main thing about John and why he came to our attention is because he was arrested in Hillary Clinton's office, and he will tell you why he did what he did.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for asking me. Yeah, I would like to talk about the action at Hillary Clinton's office. It was when we were demonstrating at a Camp Casey set up on Pine Lawn Road by Pax Christi. It was on the October 26th. On that day, the newspapers all had the pictures of the 2,000 servicemen perishing in Iraq. And I felt on that day that it was an opportunity, especially considering that Cindy Sheehan was being arrested in Washington. That was a bit of an inspiration to me to do a little bit more than we normally do in protesting. I felt that I sing songs and play guitar and support the peace movement with music and get to demonstrations when I can. But I felt that there needed to be something more done, and that opportunity presented itself. And so I took that opportunity. And it was a strange turn for a former police officer to put himself in that position, but I found it a very easy, grounded response to what was going on. And it seemed very proper, as much proper as my actions when they took place during my tenure with the police department. So I was again fighting for justice, fighting crime. The fact is that I was subsequently arrested and charged with a violation of disorderly conduct, went to court, traded the long drawn out, after 2 appearances, a trial wouldn't be a jury trial anyway, it would be a trial in front of a judge. At my last appearance in court, they offered me ACD, which is adjourned contemplating dismissal. And I could accept that only if I got a chance to read my statement in court, which I did, and which I'm going to recite for you now. And it's this: the basis for my actions called to the attention of Senator Clinton the apparent misuse of our military and the National Guard of the state of New York, being that this is the state court that I was standing in, subjecting them to injury, death, and forcing them into combat against civilian populations. The premise of this war has been proven baseless, and therefore the continuation of this war constitutes a crime. And it is in the effort to halt that crime that I raise my objections at Senator Clinton's office. On October 26, over 275 more of our since October 26, 275 more of our military personnel have been killed and it appeared that a criminal motivation in perpetrating the war. And I said we needed to object to the inaction of our local leaders. And when I was referring to local leaders, I was not just referring to Senator Hillary Clinton. I was referring to the leaders of our counties, towns, who have ignored the responsibility to look at the criminal perpetration of this war and to continue to raise issues such as assaults on immigrants, such as assaults on gays, and using the same deceptive sleight of hand that the administration of this country is using to keep us distracted from the actual crimes that are taking place right before our eyes. This gets away from my statement, which I'm going to finish. My conscience demands that I stand before you today, just as my conscience dictates that it is my civil responsibility, upon observation of a violent crime in progress, to halt that crime for protection of the victim or victims, and to report it to the authorities who hold responsibility for that jurisdiction. I have probable cause to believe that a crime is being committed against the people of this state. And I bring that premise before you today, and while I am no longer an active police officer in this state, it doesn't lessen my responsibility to speak out. And that was the statement that I read to the judge. He accepted it gracefully. I don't know whether he was amused by my presence there, because it's unusual for a police officer to be in that position, but he did grant me the latitude to express myself. The outstanding thing in my mind as a retired police officer, watching and knowing about crime, which is what I was trained to understand when I was an active police officer. Not on the level of a district attorney, not on the level of a superior officer, but on the level of a street cop. That's what I was. I was a street cop. I handled crime in the streets. For a while, I worked, in my last year and a half on the job, I worked in anti-crime, which is basically a plainclothes assignment where you patrol the areas of the city of New York and look for potential and crimes in progress. And when I look back at the experiences of my time in the police department, and I look at the orchestration of the antics of the politicians of the United States and of our local government, I say to myself, this warrants an investigation. This warrants more than an investigation. I don't have to be a state attorney general to tell you that the state attorney general's office of this state has ignored the fact that the National Guard of this state have been sent to war, ill-prepared, okay, and with less than honest reasoning. And that holds true for the administration of the federal government. Now that evidence is on the surface, less than it was, more than it was in Vietnam. That evidence was more hidden in Vietnam, and it took a longer time for it to get out. Now that evidence is on the surface. We have heads of state admitting to felony crime on television, and we need to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. Whether you be a Democrat committing a felony, whether you be a Republican committing a felony, you're committing a crime against the American people, okay? And we need to understand that their doctrine and their agenda is inconsistent at the very least with what the requirements and the needs and the constitutional rights of the American people are. We need to identify that their agenda is not consistent with our agenda. And once we identify that, we can see that the reasoning behind their actions. If I were to say to you that I question all of the policies of the Bush administration based on the alignment with what's good for the people, and I see that they don't fit, if I was to base it on another theory, that perhaps they're serving, those policies are serving the purpose of the Bush administration, of our Congress, of the people of the in control, not an agenda that serves the people of the United States, but an agenda that serves individuals, then these policies make sense. Because if I don't have to have any regard for your rights, then I can do a lot of things which might seem mystical to you, but will in fact be good for me and be good for my purpose, which, as Carmen just very plainly stated, is not the installation of democracy in places around the globe, but to better the financial positions and to better the hold on control of the resources of the people of the world. And if we go back in history, we can see that the patterns and the templates that they use for this perpetuation are the same. I had the great honor of listening to Harry Belafonte speak last night, and he was speaking about McCarthyism and what was going on in the 50s. And he was speaking about what went on during World War I and during World War II, and we were talking. He was talking about the actuation of these perpetrations of sleight of hand that they use to make us think one thing that they're doing, but in actuality, behind the scenes, they're doing quite another. If we identify that and understand it for what it is, then we won't be so far misled by the politicians and the voices that are coming out. I did not expect a reaction from Hillary Clinton to change her stance on the war from my protest. Okay, I expected not in the least. At the time of the protest, they asked me, who would you like to talk to, in order to get me out of that facility and get me on my way and end the, obviously uncomfortable and embarrassing situation they were in. And I said, I don't wish to talk to anybody. We made our statement. I'm here to protest. I'm not changing Hillary's mind because Hillary's committed to a different agenda. She's not concerned with what I have to say. I don't think she's concerned with what we have to say. She's concerned in pacifying, okay, and making it look like there's a conflict and I'm going to work for this and I'm going to work for that. But on the other side of that, the die is cast. Or in my mind, I'm speaking for myself when I make these observations. So what I also walked away from that lecture that Harry Belafonte gave with was this. He said, what the world is waiting for and what the people of the United States can do to change, and only they can change it, is for you to stand up. And he was talking to the audience. And that's what we need to do. We need to stand up. It's not enough to just passively think and talk about it on the telephone. I guess we have to make the commitment of getting out there and showing ourselves and doing something about it. And I must tell you, it's the greatest feeling in the world to be free enough to go out there and speak our minds about this deplorable condition. And with each day that goes by and with each action that takes place, I get the feeling that these are signs that I know I'm on the right path, perhaps better than I've ever been in my life, because I know what I'm fighting here, and I can see the evidence of the crime that's being committed against the people, and the horrific crime that's being committed against our servicemen. And so therefore I feel like I'm on the right track, and I hope that each and every one of us here, who I know are here for the right reasons and to support what we're all talking about, can spread that to everyone else and can make can make demonstration user-friendly so that more people come out to demonstrations, because you meet the best people at demonstrations. That's what you do. You meet the best people. I thank you very much. My time is up. Again, it's a very big honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I hope we all take courage from your action and allow our indignation and outrage to be fueled. Our last speaker before we go to Matt Donna's film is Joe Giannini. Joe, why don't you come on up? Joe has made himself well known on the East End with his talks and his actions. He was in Vietnam in the 1st Battalion of 3rd Marines from 1967 to 1968. And in November 2004, he started the East End Vets Against the War. But I hope you'll talk to us about the other thing.
Everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My name is Joseph. In March of 1966, I was issued this Marine Corps overcoat in Paris Island. Still fits.
Oh, Greg. Mine doesn't.
In June of 1967, I left for Vietnam. I turned 24 on the way to Vietnam. I served the 13 months in 3 different rifle companies as a rifle platoon leader, an executive officer of a rifle company. When I got to Vietnam, I thought, or was led to believe, that we were going over there to fight communism. I didn't even know what communism was, but I went there because I was taught by my dad, your country, right or wrong. When I got there, about a month later, I wrote home to my mom and my dad and my sister that we weren't there to fight communists, we weren't there to bring them freedom and democracy, that there was a civil war going on over there, and we all wanted to come home, and we couldn't. And I realized then that it was either a big mistake, or maybe even a big lie. Now, I think it was a big lie. I think one of the reasons we were sent to Nam was hubris, that we had to show the Soviets and the Chinese that we had all these nice weapons and we were ready to use them. I think another reason was corporate greed, because what I found out is that many of the bases that were being built in Vietnam were built by Kellogg, Brown, and Root. When I was in Paris Island, every night when we got into our rack, our bed, we used to say some prayers. One of the prayers was to a guy by the name of Smedley Butler. You ever hear of him?
Yeah.
And the prayer went like this. Good night, Smedley Butler. Wherever you are, God bless you. What I didn't realize is that Smedley Butler left the Marine Corps, I think, in the mid-30s. And he wrote an essay about war. And the essay was, War is a Racket. The profit is measured in dollars, and the losses are measured in lives. When I came home from Vietnam, I thought I had put that war behind me. And I got on with my life. I think there were many vets like me that just couldn't bring themselves to protest while some of their friends were still back in Vietnam and fighting. Some of us did have the courage, like Kerry, and he spoke out against the war. I admire him for that. So here I am, and it's 38 years later, and the war that I left behind in Vietnam has finally caught up to me again. And all across this land right now, there are veterans like me that are stepping forward. And I want to tell you about these veterans called a Band of Veterans. Have you heard about them? I think it was actually in this February, about 50 of them came together in the Capitol. They're all veterans, a lot of them Vietnam veterans. They're all against the war. They're all Democrats, and they're all running for Congress. I want you to keep this date, set this date aside, May 31st, 2006 in Southampton. 21st, I'm sorry. May 21st, 2006 in Southampton. We're going to do a fundraiser for the Band of Veterans. That's the Southampton Democrats, the East Hampton Democrats, the Norfolk People of Conscience are going to be there, and the East End Vets. It's a hard act to follow that movie, Fallujah. But I'm not going to stay up here much longer because what really happened in Fallujah, I think, is that after those 4 contractors got killed, our government decided we got to teach them a lesson. And they flattened Fallujah. They basically destroyed it to save it, I guess you would say. You see what that experience does to our young men and even our young women. Anyhow, I'm going to move on. I don't want to step here too long. As you know, back during the presidential campaign, I came together with some vets, and we called ourselves the Veterans for Kerry. Do you remember that? Yeah. And why we came together was to counteract what the Swift Boat vets for truth were doing to him. They were slandering him. When he lost the election, we decided that we would not disband, and we became the East End Vets. But we are open to everybody, and in fact, we meet almost every Monday at the Lutheran congregation in Bridgehampton. Every Sunday. Actually, what's happening to me is that I'm just recovering from a little bug, and my throat is very dry, and I'm trying to get it together. But anyhow, every Sunday. One of the things that we've done, and I'm very proud of, is we came up with an idea to honor our fallen. And what we did is, back in March of 2005, we produced approximately 1,500 of these. Do you remember seeing these anywhere? 1,500 crosses, crescents, and stars of David. And the first place we planted them, or we placed them, was in East Hampton. And we've gone around to 4 different places. We do this to honor our fallen and to remember, or to make Americans remember the sacrifice that has been made by our men and women. But look at this cross. Look at this cross. It represents a fallen soldier, a man or a woman. But in many cases, if you look around now at these photos, it represents someone left behind, a wife, a husband, a son, or sons or daughters, a grandfather, a grandmother, uncles, aunts, and friends. That's what they really represent. I looked on the web today, and I think the total was something like 2,370, I'm not sure now, and over 17,000 wounded. In Vietnam, there was a term that I guess, I don't know if we ever used it, but we knew of it. Maybe we wouldn't even mention it. It was called poncho rotation. Anybody ever hear of that? If you watch the news now and you see a video or a photograph of a dead American, you might actually see that they're wrapped in a poncho. In Vietnam, when a Marine was killed, we wrapped him in his own poncho. And we called that poncho rotation. Every Marine would start his trip home in his own poncho. Recently, I spoke to a young Iraqi veteran back from the war. In fact, he fought in the battle El Nazariya. You've heard of that. It was one of the worst battles of the war. And he was telling me that during one particular fight for that city of El Nazariya, an RPG round came right through his Amtrak. He was driving it. And he had to go back into the Amtrak and pull out his buddies. Dead buddies. And I couldn't help but ask, and then what did you do? He says, we wrapped them in their ponchos. Well, I want to stop the war. I believe we were lied. I don't know why we're there, but I think it's about oil. I think it's about corporate greed. I think it's about hubris. I think it's about revenge. But it's all based on lies. And I want to bring our troops home now. I want to take back our government. I want to put people in office that have the courage to say, bring our troops home now, and to start even thinking about impeaching Bush and those people around him. I want to see accountability. And I'm telling you, I have made a decision that I will not support any politician unless they come out and they stand with another Marine, John Murtha, who's already come to the conclusion that we've done everything we could do militarily, we've accomplished the mission, bring them home now. And it will take time to get them out of there. And let's start talking again about accountability. And so I've decided that I won't vote for any Democrat unless that Democrat stands with John Murtha and has already said and will say, bring the troops home now.